Before I started growing indoors commercially, I sold hydroponic growing equipment from like 2013 until 2019 in Juneau. So I'm pretty familiar with all the equipment. If you guys are thinking about, things that you might want to buy for your house or something like that, bring it up. And I'm pretty familiar with all the different ways that people get things done in an indoor garden. So let's get started. Uh-oh. Where'd Emily go? Oh, there it is. All right, so I've helped a lot of people start gardens before, and over that time, I've kind of come up with these two questions, which I think is really helpful for people to ask themselves before they start growing indoors, just so that there's not letdowns and disappointments. I mean, real generally, what do you want to get out of it? And I think that the number one thing should always be like fun and enjoyment, or else you're probably not going to do it very long, and it's not worth really putting much of your time and energy into. But besides for kind of the enjoyment of just growing things, you can get food, medicine, education, and I think those things are really important too. And then when you want to think about what you're going to put into it, or what you're willing to put into it, I think the big ones there would be like your time and energy as you maintain the garden day to day, the space in your house or whatever this indoor area is that you want to dedicate that, because I don't know, unless you live in a giant mansion or something, space is often, an important thing in your house. And oh yeah, the most important thing, I guess, maybe would be money, because nothing's free in the universe. So that's going to be something that's going to be like an investment that you have to put into it. And when you think about those things, you can save on some of those areas, but not all of them usually. And the more you want to save in one, the more it's going to cost you in another. So if you want to get out a whole lot and you don't want to put in a whole lot of your time or energy, then you're going to have to put in a lot more money, or something like that. You know what I mean? Or if you want to save money, maybe you can put in more of your time and energy. But all those things are definitely related, and just good things to think about so that you don't get disappointed. I mean, this is a Master Gardeners Conference, so I assume that most of you guys are pretty well versed when it comes to growing plants, or you have a garden outside. Yes, no, yeah, most of you. And so you really need to think about a lot of the same things that you'd think about when you're growing plants outside. It's just a little bit different when it comes to actual indoor gardening. Like if you're growing plants that need a lot of light and it's outside, you put it in a place in your yard that's going to get full sun. Or if a plant needs shade, you might put it in another spot that only gets sun in the afternoon. Whereas if you're growing indoors, especially when it comes to the lighting, that's like you're 100% in control of how much light the plants get, how long it's on for, those kind of things. So you just want to make the appropriate choice indoors, just like you would outdoors. The air outdoors, you don't really have much control of it. So you have to pick plants that are going to work. I forgot. That's okay. In the climate that you live in, indoors, you want to think about it too, but you're kind of in control of that, or you want to be, or else it's going to be a bad spot for your plants to live. The water and the nutrients in the growing medium are pretty, again, similar to outside. The plants need as much water as they need. Indoors, it's a little different, obviously, because there's not going to be any rain. Nutrients and growing medium would basically be the same, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later. So starting with the lights, there are just a ton of choices when it comes to things to buy for setting up indoor gardens. And I know, like, I have a lot of familiarity with it, but I could see from outside, if you just like Google it or something like that, you're going to have tons of different things, and everyone sells the best light and it's the best color, but they're all saying different things, so it's hard to kind of to get to the bottom of it. But I think there's really three things that I always look at, especially when I'm looking at some sort of fixture company that I'm not like really well versed in. And it'll tell you a whole lot about what you're looking at. The first is the wattage, which would be like how much power does this light take when you plug it into the wall. That's like the most important thing, I'd say, because you're not going to get more out than you put in. So after the wattage, you could look at the efficiency, which would mean like how much light are you getting out per unit of energy that you put into it. And one kind of number that's helpful and you can find for a lot of lights, especially lights that are like actually worth something, they'll give you this number that they write in micromoles per joule, which is basically just the amount of photons that are created per watt of energy that gets put in. You know, joule is actually a watt per second. It's an insanely large number if you actually look it up. It's some like 10 to the 27th or something. So it's a lot of photons, but that doesn't matter. It's just a way that you can compare lights that may look completely different. It kind of puts them into the same category, I guess. And then the third is the price. And honestly, there's really, again, like nothing free in the universe. So if you have a light that's powerful and efficient, it's going to be expensive. If it's not expensive, it's not going to be powerful or efficient, you know? So a lot of times, like you could go to Home Depot and they sell lights there, which I would not recommend buying. And they're not very expensive, but again, they're also not very powerful and they're not very efficient. So it's kind of just like a cheap piece of junk. And you know, these sort of things, if you are going to invest in a you know, an indoor garden, the lighting is super important because it's like the engine of the whole thing. So if you had a really fancy sports car and it doesn't have the right engine, it's just like for show and it won't do what you want it to do. And so, within these lighting, there's really only like three kind of general types that I would recommend at all. And we'll go into those kind of here in a little bit more depth. The first one is LEDs. Everyone's heard about them, light emitting diodes, especially, I mean, they get better and better every year. The quality goes up, the price comes down. And I'd say for most people, if you're really serious about growing indoors, LEDs are pretty much the right choice for almost everyone at this point, with a few exceptions. But the real benefits of LED is that it's quite efficient. So that number that I mentioned earlier, the micromoles per joule, LEDs I've seen as high as like 3.8 micromoles per joule, which again, the absolute value of that number is one thing, but you can compare it to other things, and we'll show you. So just give you kind of the relative idea. They're super flexible, meaning that like they come in a lot of different forms. You can have small skinny ones that the plants are meant to be close to, that are low wattage, that maybe start seeds with. And then you can have other ones that would be like big, powerful lights that you can hang higher off your plants if you're going to grow like tomatoes or something like that. And so they come everything in between. So there's a lot of different options for different types of gardens. And that's one definite benefit. And then also they last a super long time. So a lot of them are rated to be like still 90% effective at 50,000 hours, for example, which is like if you're growing 12 hours a day, 50,000 hours is like 11 years or something. So they last quite a long time, and you're not gonna have to replace bulbs or anything like that as you go. And the drawback is the cost, but actually that's really only the initial cost, because again, like the really long lifespan and the fact that you don't have to replace bulbs and things like that, it's actually usually cheaper in the end. You save a little bit of power, but yeah, just initially you can spend a decent amount of money on like a quality LED light.
Just question. So
Yeah.
when you say cost, like
So again, it depends on the power. Oh, that's one thing I was going to mention, actually. I'm glad you brought that up, because the more powerful the light is, the less that you pay per watt of energy that you get out of it. So if you're doing like a little seedling setup, and you might have like a 2 foot by 4 foot area that you're starting your seeds under, you could pay upwards of $3 a watt. So you might buy a 100 watt fixture and it could cost you like $300. If you go up into more powerful fixtures, like there's a really common wattage light that's meant to grow over a 4 foot by 4 foot area. It's kind of gotten really popular with cannabis growers, but those are like around 600 watts. And those you might spend about like between around $1 or $1.50 per watt. So per watt, it gets cheaper as you get to bigger lights. Yeah, but anywhere, again, depending on what you're trying to grow, but for a small area, a few $100. For a large area, like a 4x4, it could go up to $1,000. This high intensity discharge lighting, I'm sure everyone's probably familiar with, like high pressure sodium and a metal halide. You guys heard these terms before? Those are really, so the high intensity discharge means there's some sort of a mixture of gas and they put the power to it and it ignites and it causes really hot, really bright lights. I mean, the actual bulb or the ignition inside the bulb is like in the thousands of degrees. So it gets, they're big and they're powerful. And this is what like greenhouse growers, you know, especially 10, 15 years ago, that was like the only option in greenhouses and stuff. So they're quite common like throughout the world. The benefits of them is that they're super powerful. So I mean, like I said, you get out what you put into it. So even if they're not quite as efficient as a LED, just the fact that you can have a 1,000 watt fixture, it puts out a lot of usable light. So you can grow a lot with it. I put heat as a benefit and a drawback because depending on what you're doing with it, it could be a benefit. Like if you're trying to, like in Alaska, extend a growing season in your greenhouse and you're going to be wanting to heat the greenhouse anyways, you could put a 1,000 watt LED at the top of a greenhouse and it would light up a 10 by 10 area. And it would add basically like a 1,000 watt heater running in your greenhouse. Whereas if you bought a LED to supplement lighting, then you had to pay to have a whatever electric heater or something running in your greenhouse. It would sort of, you might as well go for something where you kind of kill two birds with one stone. The drawbacks, I guess, you know, compared to LEDs, which could be up to 3.8 micromoles per joule, the high intensity discharge could get close to 2, but it's almost always going to be like slightly under 2 in that micromoles per joule. And that's going to be even if you get the very most efficient lamps that have come out, because they've actually still been making quite a bit of progress in the high intensity discharge lighting over the last 10 years, probably mostly thanks to cannabis growers, because a lot of them still use these lights. Compared to like 20 years ago, there were big heavy magnetic ballasts that were also quite inefficient. So you had a lot of resistance in them and you lost a lot of power just getting the power to the lamp. So those have all become digital. And then they've changed the way the bulbs are constructed and the gases that they put in them. And so the new types of high intensity lighting, the high pressure sodiums have mostly turned into these double-ended lamps. And then the metal halides have turned into ceramic metal halide, which is actually a 315 watt fixture. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that's actually a really nice light. And at 2 micromoles per joule is pretty dang efficient. And so you can get a lot of good growth out of these lights. The thing is, for most people, if you're in your house and you want to turn on, I mean, 1,000 watt high pressure sodium in a spare bedroom is almost always overkill. And so you plant it's going to be like too close to your plants. It's going to cause too much heat. So it's usually not good unless you have a garage or a greenhouse or something like that, where you can deal with the heat. And I forgot to mention when I was at the LED side, I put this little 4x4 space to give you kind of an idea of how many watts it would take to light up that amount of space. With the LEDs, it was like 400 to 600 watts to fill up a 4x4 indoor garden. With the high intensity discharge, it's really more like 600 to 1,000 if you wanted to do a really well lit 4x4 area. But I threw in the 315 because it could almost do it. And for people, if you don't really care, it's so much about like the edges of the garden being as bright as the middle. You could probably do something like that. And then the last one that I kind of would go over is the fluorescents. Most people are familiar with these. There's really three kinds of fluorescents. The ones that I talk about and would even recommend at all for growing is the high output T5s, which are the really small bulbs. So all fluorescents are labeled as either like a T5, which is 5/8 of an inch in diameter. And then you might be more familiar with like T8s, which are common like shop light fixtures. Those are they're 1 inch in diameter, 8/8. And then there's also even older lamps that were T12s. And those are 1.5 inches in diameter. It's tempting to use those, the T8s and the T12s, because you might like already have them at your house or something like that. And you can buy grow light lamps for them, but they're really just not worth growing with unless you're just like want to germinate seeds for like a week or two at the most. The efficiency of those T8s and T12s is just horrendous compared to the other options that are out there. Even the T5s are maybe 1 or slightly less than 1 micromole per joule. So the LEDs could be almost 4 times as effective watt for watt. The T8s would say like, say a T5 over 4 feet, 1 bulb is 54 watts, whereas a shop light is going to produce less light than that with 2 33-watt T8 lamps. So you can just kind of see like, if you do go this route, the T5 is really the only way to go. It does have some benefits, I guess, because they're relatively inexpensive, at least like right off the bat. And they're pretty low wattage, so you don't have to worry about, as long as you're only plugging a few of them in, tripping a breaker or something like that. But like I said, they're not efficient. And then once you start using them, the cost goes up pretty quickly because the lamp itself has a really short life. So if you run it for, 12 or 16 hours a day or something, if you're starting seeds, you'll hit this like 3,000 hour mark really pretty quickly. And then the lamp kind of needs to be replaced, or else it still draws the same amount of power, but you don't get as much like growing power out of it after you get over that number. So if you really want to get something out of it, you end up replacing these lamps, and they could cost like 10-15 bucks a piece. But what you can do, if you already bought some of these fixtures and you're like, oh crap, and you go to buy a new lamp for it, they are making now LED replacement lamps, which will go right into a T5 fixture, and you don't have to change the ballast out or anything like that. And so those are nice because then you'll run a little bit less wattage, and the lamps will last a lot longer. Okay, the other one that we mentioned earlier that's a lot different than if you're growing outside is the air. And when I'm talking about air, really, there's just a few things that I'm talking about, like the temperature of the air, the humidity of the air, and the movement of the air. And those are all things that outside you either have zero control over, well, actually, all of those things, yeah, you have zero control over if you're outside. So you have to pick plants appropriately. Whereas inside, it's different. You can pick whatever plants you want, but then you have to think about these things and how it's going to affect what you're actually growing. Uh, when you put plants and lights inside, they're going to add heat, humidity. The oxygen is, I guess, just a benefit no matter what, especially if it's in your house. But the heat and the humidity could become an issue. And then they take away CO2. So the temperature and the humidity also are closely related, and they affect each other. So if you're trying to say like, what's the perfect temperature to grow plants, it does depend on the humidity that's in the room, and vice versa. So if the temperature is low, the humidity needs to be lower. If the temperature is high, the humidity needs to be higher, generally speaking. And that kind of refers to, there's an acronym VPD, which is like a vapor pressure deficit. And you can look up, if you're growing pretty much any plant, you could search for that online and see what the ideal vapor pressure deficit would be for the plants that you're growing. And basically kind of what that means, and it's pretty easy to understand, I think, that if you have a really hot room, the plants are going to want to have to get rid of a lot of moisture to cool themselves down. And so the humidity needs to be higher, so that when they open up the stomata in their leaves, they don't feel this incredible suction of the air trying to vaporize the water, because there's so much hot air can hold tons of water. And so if there's not very much humidity in the air, the relative humidity is low, water has a tendency to vaporize quickly. And the plants, when they open their leaves to breathe, they feel like they're going to have, the air is pulling water out of them. So a higher humidity will help them be able to breathe and relax. And whereas if the temperature is cold, the air can hold much less humidity. So if the humidity is high and it's cold, the plant goes to try and breathe, and it's trying to put vapor into the air, and it just, the air outside is sort of pushing back on the plant, and so it can't breathe. And you want to have a happy medium where the plant is free to open up and transpire, but the air isn't actively pulling it out. You can compensate for issues like that a little bit indoors, even if you can't get one of these things under control. Say with like, if the temperature is too high and the humidity is too low, you can give your plants more water, and you can have it be a little bit less nutrients in that water, so that they can go through more water without running into over fertilization issues. And then the CO2 that gets taken away is really only a problem if you have a whole bunch of plants in a very small space with no people in there. But for most people, it's not something that you really need to worry about. And it actually is just kind of a benefit that they're producing oxygen, you're producing CO2, kind of live happy together. So and at the bottom, I mean, most plants are going to be pretty happy where you keep your house. If you're happy, they're going to be happy, unless you're growing something that's like really unusual. 65 to 75 degrees and 50 to 60% humidity. So a small garden in a room in your house is going to only help to add a little bit of humidity and a little bit of warmth in the wintertime, when your house is probably already paying to be heated and is extremely dry. Probably drier than most people would want it, especially in the winter around here. So to deal with the air, the heat, the humidity, and the movement is fans. There's some other stuff if fans don't work, and we can talk briefly about that. But really, in indoor gardens, there's two types of fans. I have inline fans. There's a little picture of it. And then conventional fans. I don't know what to call those, but these are ones that you're like oscillating fans, wall mount fans, clip fans. They come in all shapes and sizes. The inline fans are good because they will move air from one place to another place with like ducting and things like that. So these are exhaust fans. They remove humidity, they remove heat. By doing those things, they'll inevitably bring in fresh air to the space that they're ventilating. And they can be automated easily with like thermostats or humidistats to go on and off depending on the conditions inside the grow area. And then the conventional fans will just move air around within the garden, which is usually helpful because the plants don't want to be sitting in their own, as they transpire, you want to clear that away from the leaves and just bring in, fresh air that's less humid and has fresh CO2 for them. Otherwise, they're just kind of like sitting in stagnant air, usually not super happy. So this is kind of my, in case you want to set up a stick farm, this is how you do it. I don't know, I didn't put a single leaf on these plants. But anyway, it's not for the plants. This is how you would set up kind of a grow room of really any size. There's an exhaust fan at the top where heat naturally wants to go to the top anyways. So if you're exhausting, you put that at the top. There's a carbon filter on here. If you ever want to make the exhaust air smell like nothing at all, you could take it through a carbon filter and that will clean any kind of like volatile smells out of the air. On the other side at the bottom from your exhaust fan would be a passive air intake. And you want to make sure, just a quick rule of thumb, if you ever set up a garden like this, that if you have a passive air intake, it needs to be 3 times the area of the exhaust fan. So exhaust fans are usually in like 4-inch, a 6-inch, an 8-inch, a 12-inch, depending on how big of an area is trying to be ventilated. And you would need 4 times the area, or 3 times, excuse me, for a passive air intake, or else your fan is going to be pulling too hard and trying to pull a vacuum. If you don't account for the intake, you won't be able to exhaust air. It'll turn on and make a lot of noise, but it needs to have an area for the air to come in. So that's passive. You could also add a slightly smaller fan on the intake air, and it would be like they would run at the same time. And then the grow light in the middle. In larger rooms, the wall mount fans work just to kind of mix air around within the space as it's coming from one side to the other. In a small room, sometimes it's not even necessary because you can have enough airflow just with just from the exhaust fan. The water. You guys are all probably familiar with thinking about these sort of things. Like I said, indoors, there's a few other things to think about. Without any rain ever, you definitely have to think about how you're going to give your plants water. So either you do it by hand, you can set up all kinds of fancy automated watering systems too. Again, that's one of those things, like either it's your time watering the plants or it's your money. To set up a system like that kind of saves you time in the long run, but costs you something to set up front. The other thing is like where you put your garden within your house. You want to think about how you're going to get the water from your faucet or wherever you're going to get it from to that spot. Because if it's like put it up in your attic and you got to climb some stairs or a ladder with a bucket of water or something, it's like zero fun. So think about that for sure. And then also, how are you going to keep it off your floor? And then also what happens if you don't keep it off your floor? Because almost all the time, like things spill or flood or something. And so if you have an upstairs carpeted spare bedroom, it might not be a really great idea to put 100 gallons of water in automated pumps and things like that can fail and then you end up with like 100 gallons of water raining down in your kitchen or something like that. But other than that, it's similar to what you think of outside. You know, where's your water coming from? What's in it? If you guys use tap water to water your plants, I mean, there's, especially in Anchorage, there's really not much in it at all compared to a lot of places that you could be. A lot of people are concerned about chlorine, which I don't know, may affect the plants a little bit at the levels that we have in our water. And if you want to make sure you don't have any of that, you could let it sit out for a day or something. But usually that's not a problem. And then, you know, what, if anything, are you going to need to add to it? And that, the answer to that question depends on like how you're growing your plants. Because, you know, you could have plants that are growing in like a rich organic soil, and then you don't need to add anything to your water. Or if you have a hydroponic setup in your spare bedroom, you're going to need to be adding water with every irrigation. And the nutrients, I don't know how many questions you guys have about this sort of thing. This is very similar to what you would be doing outside, and there's nothing particularly special about what plants need inside nutritionally compared to what they need outside. One thing that I have found though, like indoor garden stores is a lot more focused on like bottles of nutrients, whereas outdoors people don't use those quite as often because it's easier to have like the whole soil food web in your organic garden outside. When you come inside, it does lean a little heavier on those bottled nutrients because it's a little bit difficult to recreate the whole soil food web in small pots and containers and things like that when you bring it indoors. Do you guys have any questions particularly about the nutrients inside versus outside? No. This also plays into a little bit of the nutrient part, depending on how you grow your plants or what they're actually growing in. And so on these two extremes, I write soil, soilless, and hydroponics. Are you guys familiar with those terms generally? Because on the one hand, soil is like what you deal with in your garden outside. You know, all the nutrients that your plants need to grow and for the season or whatever are in the soil. And then you just water them and they grow, and it's like literally almost like magic. I mean, it's a whole universe that happens in there to make that possible. There's soilless mixes, which kind of look like soil, and those are pretty popular indoors. Oh, one big thing I'll mention too about the soil, the indoor soil and outdoor soil are a little bit different. Usually, I mean, you could make one work, but if you go to Home Depot and buy the Miracle Grow moisture control or organic soil that you might put into your garden, and then you put it into a pot and you try and grow indoors with it, it's going to be like usually much too wet. So if you go and you get a soil that's specifically made for indoor gardens, you'll almost always find a lot more aeration mixed into it. So like a third of it will be perlite, and it'll be a quicker draining, quicker drying soil so that you can water more often and it actually dries out. So I found a lot of the outdoor soils are different in that regard. The soilless mixes are basically soil with all of the stuff taken out of it, all the nutrients. So it looks pretty similar. Perlite, coconut core. I don't know if you guys are probably familiar with Pro Mix. To me, that's like a soilless thing. There might be a little bit of organic nutrients in there, but pretty much you need to add nutrients to that if you're growing in it. And then hydroponics, there are a few mediums that are really specific to hydroponics. One is like rock wool, which comes in all different shapes and forms, from little tiny things to start seeds in to big giant slabs that commercial tomato growers use in greenhouses and stuff. And on the very extreme end, there's almost no growing medium, where you have like an aeroponic system where it's just something to hold the plant and the roots grow and they're misted misted with water. And honestly, I think all those different things have a place indoors if you want them to, you know what I mean? It's just a matter of kind of understanding like what you're trying to do, picking one that you like. And keep in mind that the soil is a little bit more difficult to deal with indoors than it is in your garden, just because that is such a complex system that you kind of have to recreate. Inside can sometimes be difficult. All right, now I'll talk about kind of some gardens that I think you guys might be interested in setting up. This is actually like my all-time favorite personal grow setup. If you wanted to actually set up a dedicated indoor space. And grow tents come in all different sizes and shapes, but the one I have up here is a 3x3 grow tent, which is good if you just want it. You could grow literally almost any plants in this tent with this light setup. But again, they come in any shapes and sizes, and they are by far the fastest way to set up a grow room in your house. I mean, if you can think back to that diagram I had up, you know, you don't really want to drill like an 8-inch hole in your spare bedroom wall, or like, you know, something like that. It's a big commitment. So you could throw up a grow tent like this and all the holes are already there. You don't have to hang anything from the ceiling because you can hang it right from the stuff or right from the bars, like at the top of the grow tent. In this particular tent though, so I used the 315 watt light emitting ceramic, or the ceramic metal halide, which is a really awesome light. And for one thing that I like about it so much is it's perfectly clear. So like of all the, that's one thing that I didn't mention, but you should think about the spectrum of the light does matter, especially because you are going to have to be there with the plants. And sometimes some spectrums of light are extremely obnoxious to be under, you know, if it's like a purple light or something. I would sacrifice some efficiency to have some pleasant experience while you're actually like in the garden and you can see the plants. So this is a really close to the color of the sun. So the plants look like they're supposed to look, and it's pretty pleasant for you to be under. The thing about grow tents though is that they absolutely need to be ventilated, because even if you have, there's such small spaces that even a small light inside of a space like that is going to heat it up. And even it's so small, the plants will run out of CO2. There won't be any air movement. It's just like absolute must if you have a grow tent. So here it's really easy to have a fan with a speed controller, and then which would be like a rheostat, and so it can affect whether it's going full bore and it's super loud and moving tons of air, or you can turn it down and it'll move a little bit more slowly, and you can just kind of easily adjust those things to kind of find a happy medium. They're nice with small lights like this, 315 watts. If you put this into a spare room in your house, you can just move the heat from the little tent into the room that it's growing in, and you use your house as like a heat sink. So you don't have to worry about like cooling or anything like that, because it'll just heat up the room that it's in a little bit. But the plants you're growing will probably be happy with a little bit of extra heat. And when this is all zipped up, like this is a picture taken when the front zipper is, or the front door, I guess, is open. But this is zipped up here, and over on the other side are some mesh vents. And so when it's all zipped up, the air goes up from the bottom and then out the exhaust at the top. And you don't have to worry about any fans or anything like that to move the air, because it'll almost be like breezy in the whole tent when everything's running. This is another one that I think people might like. Like we were talking about this before the talk started. This is a cool setup because you could do something, you could grow with it in the wintertime when your garden is covered in snow, and then you could use it in the springtime to get all your plants started to move out to your garden when the snow's all gone. I don't have exactly the stuff that we use written up here, mainly because the lights that we used here, you can't buy anymore. Kind of an interesting side story. Well, the lighting company that made these lights was sold last year for $100 million, and then was immediately shut down because they were just bought by a competitor and then shut down. It was pretty crazy, but there's a lot of money in indoor gardening right now. But anyway, at least in the equipment side. But a rack like this is really cool because it's perfect for, like I said, you could do seedlings and microgreens in the wintertime, and then start all your garden starts out here. And you can actually get a ton of plants out of something like this. You know, if you have a 10 by 20 tray, it's going to hold like 18 3.5-inch pots. So you could have 72 starts per level. You know, if you had a thing like this, that'd be like 288 garden starts that you could get going for spring, which would be like, depending on the type of plants, quite a lot of plants. If you, so you think about those things when you decide like how many levels that you'd want to set up. No matter what light you put in it, I'd say per level, if you shoot for somewhere for around 60 to 100 watts of light, that would be a good place to start. And again, like the more length of time that you want to grow your plants, the higher you would go towards like 100 watts of light. And the more quality light you'd probably want to be looked for. Whereas if you're doing like microgreens and you just are going to start your plants a little bit early, but you don't need to grow like tomato plants for 6 weeks or something like that before you put them out in your garden, you could be more at the lower end of that, like the 60 watt level, which just for reference would be 60 watts is basically one T5 bulb, which would honestly not be very good to light an entire rack like that, even for microgreens. Just for your information, the lights that we used here, these LEDs are actually only 18 watts each. So we're only running 36 watts per level in this particular one. We only use it to grow microgreens. And in all reality, it's not the fastest way to grow microgreens. And when we grow plants any kind of long term under them, they're really not the best for it. But this is part of a display at our spot, so it looks pretty cool. Though the lights aren't really the best for growing the plants long term. So we've seen that like that wattage, that's why I didn't say like 40 to 100 watt. It's just a little bit too low to grow plants long term. I mean, microgreens are basically just past germinated, you know. And if we were using better lights, we would probably even be growing them faster to the point where we sell them. So yeah, you could, you know, if you used high output T5s, you could use 2 of those 54 watt bulbs and you'd have 108 watts per level. And those 2 bulbs would work pretty well to grow starts or microgreens. If you wanted, like one of the lights that we use in our seedling area is a Fluence Razor, and it's a 90 watt fixture and it lights up that same area and it grows really, really good. Like a Fluence Razor. No, it's Fluence, Fluence. But again, like what I would say, I mean, rather than Fluence is a great company, and we actually, our garden is set up with like almost exclusively their lights. But if you go back and you're looking online and like you could see there's a lot of great lights that I'm not specifically mentioning. And if you compare those things, the wattage, the efficiency, and the price, everything, you realize there's not as much choice as you think, you know. So if it's like all the companies is super competitive industry, and so they're all in the same ballpark, you know. If you get a light that's like very efficient, around 100 watts. And like I said, the razors that we use, I think, are 300 or $320. You know, you get something that's like those three things, it's gonna do a really good job growing seedlings, you know. And there's all this stuff like this spectrum or this spectrum, but like it doesn't matter as much as those other things that I mentioned. They all do well. And I think especially when you come at it as like maybe a novice, or even, and I still myself do this, like trust the people who make the light, you know what I mean? They like put a lot of thought into it. And so I don't like to go and like overthink, oh, I really like this purple light, or, you know, it's just like there, if it's those three things, you know, the power, the efficiency, and the cost are makes sense, then it's going to be a good light. Yeah.
What's the space, and then you start them as seeds under the light on that, or are you starting them in the dark? Then putting them under the light?
Yeah, we have a couple levels on this under here. So you could look in, some seeds need light to germinate, most don't. But even the ones that do would still probably germinate under here because it's not completely dark or something like that. You know, we use like clear domes to germinate the seeds here. We use clear domes, but we also have, most of the plants will germinate on these levels on the bottom. So we don't technically have them under lights. But again, you would want to just do a quick Google of any particular plant that you're growing, especially if you don't know, like, does the seed need light to germinate? It's super easy to find that stuff out. And different plants are slightly different. You know, did you need a heat mat? Like you can see we have a heat mat here, and some things that we grow, you know, herbs, or if we're growing micro basil or something, for sure it's going on a heat mat. If we're starting lettuce, a heat mat is going to be detrimental, you know, but that stuff's all super easy to find, even at like Johnny's website where you can order seeds. There's a graph that shows you the temperatures and things. So if you think, where's this going? Do I need a heat mat? Does it need light? That kind of stuff, super easy to find out.
Yeah, that's a good question. Just around like the spectrum of light, you try to, it really doesn't matter. Like we talk about, oh, you need red, you know, red and blue light.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like I feel like, you know, 10 years ago, LED lights were like blue or like magenta, and those were the two things, because like scientifically they've shown that those spectrums, the like blue, which is around like 400 nanometers, and the red, which is like 700 at the opposite ends of the PAR spectrum, are the most effective at driving photosynthesis. And the plants that are making leafy vegetative growth need this blue light, and the plants that are flowering need this red light. And so they was like, oh, this stuff in the middle is just totally useless. So they took it out of the light. But then things have come around a little bit full circle, and now you see a lot of full spectrum lights, because they realize like, oh my gosh, these scientific experiments like maybe weren't asking the right questions, and so the answers that they got were a little skewed. And not only is it super unpleasant to work under either of those two colors, but the plants actually recognize the green light in the middle, even though it's not driving photosynthesis like the other two. But as far as other like physiological processes that are happening within the plant are still important. So I'd say like for a home grower, my preference for sure is a full spectrum light. And because you can get, overall, they're still super efficient. And actually, I'll tell you a story, like we use full spectrum lights that look really clear and white for our seedlings. And we had one that went out, so I bought a new, apparently more efficient, if you look at the numbers, light, and it came in a pink reproductive, they called it. So it was like definitely had a pink tint to it. But when we plugged it in and put a PAR meter under it, which is basically like a lumen meter, but 10 times as expensive, and actually tells you like that between 400 and 700 nanometers, the white lights actually were reading higher than these new pink lights, you know. So, and then also everyone agreed that the color was just like really obnoxious and hard on your eyes. And so it's like, if you're going to have something at your house and you're doing it for fun and you want to enjoy your time there, like sacrifice a tiny bit of possible efficiency just so that when you look at it, you're like, ah, instead of like, ah. Yeah, so the spectrum does make a difference, but it's not like, don't overthink it. Yeah, and I personally, full spectrum is like the way to go. If you wanted to dabble in hydroponics, but you could set up something like this. Oh geez, I better hurry. We also have this is like one system that we're running at our building where we grow arugula in it. The same rack that we set up for the seedling thing, but this would be like water culture, I guess it's called. Also super easy. You know, something like this is automated in the sense that the plants are kind of taken care of day to day automatically. So it saves a little bit of time, but compared to that other system where you'd set up and you'd have to be hand watering all your plants, this one's going to cost a little bit more money because you have just more stuff to buy for it. But again, like if you're just thinking about getting into it, I would recommend, like, don't just run out and buy a whole bunch of stuff that you can't. Then like when you quit growing, you're like, oh damn, like look at all this stuff that I have now, and you're just storing it. Whereas if you just bought some pots or something, you just stack them up and use them outside, it's a lot, you'll be happier in the end. Then if you go out and buy something like this and only run it for whatever, a couple weeks, it's not going to be worth it. These lights, we actually are still, these particular lights are also available in town, which is kind of nice. These are Growers Choice PFS series, and they're 40-watt bars. So we're still in that same range as the other garden that's 80 watts per level. These are pretty expensive. Like I think the retail is somewhere around $400 for those 4 things. But they also, oh, and one thing I forgot to mention real quick, if you set up a seedling bed, look for lights that you can connect in a series. So if you're setting up a whole bunch of them, the last thing you want is like 10 power cords, you know, so then you'd have like just a total disaster to plug them in. Whereas you can see here, these lights, oops, I'm in the way here. That's annoying. Oops. Anyway, the lights connect to each other, and then all 10 of those fixtures were only on one power cord. Same thing with these all connect to one spot, and then one plug goes into the wall so that you're not dealing with a bunch of stuff that way. And you can see this is pretty much the same spectrum as before, a little bit more red, different colored diodes that they're running up there, but full spectrum still is really nice. I'll just breeze through this because I don't know if anyone's going to actually be doing this one. This is like the same type of a system as the last one, except for instead of that last one is really good for small plants that don't take a long time to grow. And this one would be good for big plants that take a long time. The one thing, like you can buy these little bucket setups. I think they're so popular even at like Home Depot. Whenever I put together a system like this, I'll always add an extra bucket because you want to think about how are you going to manage this thing over long periods of time. And if you have a giant plant growing out of a bucket and then the nutrient solution is in the bottom of that, like what are you going to do when you need to change the nutrients or access anything that's inside the bucket? It's just a disaster because you have a humongous plant. So if you add an extra bucket in, you can add water to everything. You can look inside and say, oh, how much water is in these buckets? And you see it all right there. This is a nutrient film technique, which is pretty popular way to grow like leafy greens and stuff like that. We built this really just because we had the space was already, actually, sorry, you can see it in this picture. Behind the light was already just so bright on the wall that we thought, man, we could build something here and just take advantage of this free light. And so with this one, like thinking back to the questions asked at the beginning, you know, what do you want to get out of it and what do you want to put into it? We just wanted to have something that looked really pretty and possibly, but at the end, we actually did get some berries. So that was kind of cool. But if you do an NFT garden, you want to make sure that the water is flowing really slowly. You don't need like a big giant torrent of water. And then keep in mind that the roots can grow and plug drains, and then a lot of water is just more likely to flood. This would be a garden, that we built. I'll just briefly touch on this. Are you guys familiar with aquaponics at all?
Yeah.
I think this is like the coolest way to grow indoors, period. It's so cool. There's quite a lot of downsides though, because it's a very it's like the soil food web in terms of complexity of the system that's going on. And then you got plants and fish to keep happy at the same time. And you can have just kind of an epic collapse and then everything dies. So that's so bad. But if you're doing it for fun, it's really satisfying when you get it to actually work. And basically how it works, the fish create ammonia, bacteria process that ammonia into nitrate, and then ultimately nitrite, which is just a nitrogen-rich fertilizer. And then the plants clean the water, and the water's cycled back to the fish, just like a hydroponic system, except for the one thing that you need to make sure you add if you build something like this is the biofiltration. So enough space for the bacteria to live so that they can actually process the waste.
So is our net roots in the water?
Well, with this one, it's actually a flood and drain system. So there's another fish tank inside here that's with some biofilters and some pumps, and the water is being pumped up to the grow bed on top of the fish tank. It's flooding and draining with a bell siphon, which you should Google if you ever build something like this. Really cool thing. But it automatically floods and drains mechanically. And then it's returned back to the fish tank.
So it drains into the fish.
Yeah, and it's filled with a hydroponic growing medium, expanded clay pebbles, which are basically like half air. And so the water, it's almost like a breathing grow bed. The water fills up and it pushes out old air, and then it drains and it pulls in new air, and it pushes out, and it goes up and down like that. So it's you can even add composting worms and stuff to these systems.
You get like gnats or anything?
No, we've never had them in this system. It is possible to get that stuff inside, especially if you use like soil, and if you're reusing soil, you almost always end up with those. But if it's a real problem, you can also get like little nematodes that you can add to soil, and then they eat the larva, and then they do a pretty good job. All right, and the last one, I think I'm out of time. I'll just talk about a tiny bit about, this is our garden at Anchorage Greens. I mean, we tried to not hold anything back, when we built this, because what we wanted to get out of it was just like the very best leafy greens that we possibly could. And we were pretty much willing to put anything that was necessary into it to get it out. So yeah, we chose these full spectrum lights. For us, they work really awesome. Similar water culture beds, just like that little miniature system that we went over earlier. Yeah, I'm out of time for having me. Do you have any more questions, anyone?
Yeah, where do you get the need to put soil to eat the?
Just, I can't remember where I bought them. Just Google it. Yeah, there's a lot of places. Sometimes they do, but I'd be like careful about going those places, because unless they're selling them really quickly, they're like very easy to die. Even when I had a store, well, it's hard to say if they're dead or not unless you have a microscope. But when I had a store, I ordered them and I sold them for a while, but it was hard to sell them quick enough. And then you got to keep them, and otherwise you just order them from like the place that makes them, and then they're for sure to be alive. When I looked at them under a microscope, I still have it burned in my memory. The craziness. Oh my God, it was insane. It, like, as soon as it came into focus, it was just like a mass of crazy worms squirming everywhere. It was pretty cool. And then in your hand, it just looks like a little pile of dirt. It was really cool. So if you have a microscope and you get those, give it a try.